The British hotel chain Travelodge is in serious financial trouble. It's entered a company voluntary arrangement. That's essentially one step short of bankruptcy. A bit like the American Chapter 11 laws. It's been hailed as good news because everyone gets to keep their jobs and the company carries on trading. But Professor Paul Palmer of Cass isn't convinced. Professor Palmer, why not?
Well, it's good news for the people who are keeping their jobs and why companies should continue, particularly given the current crisis. But of course the clear issues is what's got them into the crisis in the first place. And in particular, I think there were a number of ethical issues in relation to this business and the way this business is run that's not disclosed in the press report that they handed out.
Ethical issues?
Ethical issues. Whenever in business, when I look at business, or like in any, or the viewpoint of most ethical issues, you have to think about victims. And it seems to me that there are potentially three victims in this scenario. Victim number one is, of course, the British taxpayer. Because in essence, the company has been so heavily geared, it has brought so much debt into its balance sheet that it never actually pays tax. And it would be interesting to know, over the years, how much tax has Travelodge actually ever paid? Many years ago, for example, there was the Dewhurst Butchers chain run by the Vesti family. They never paid any tax. Oil companies, because they were always able to offset their never paid any tax. So at what point does corporate citizenship Britain start raising the question of should a company pay tax? And this moves us on from that the sole purpose of business, which Friedman famously said was only to, was business. And the point I'm trying to raise is that businesses, as everybody else is paying tax, businesses should be paying tax, and have the Travelodge chain in many ways, by gearing themselves so heavily, right, avoided paying tax. Now that goes into a second debate, which is the banks who lent them the money in the first place. And as I understand it, about £300 million or so is being written off. So the accountability is, of course, is that 300 million is therefore not going back to the banks. Banks are owned by shareholders. Of course, depending on who the banks are, some of those shareholders, of course, are the UK British taxpayer again. So where was the accountability of someone lending that sort of money, right? And then the third point, of course, that brings out is, was it unfair competition, right? The fact that they so highly geared themselves, were able to buy cheap properties, offer such amazing rates. Yet what about competitors? And particularly competitors in that market might be small local businesses, right? Who perhaps are working on maybe a small overdraft, most of the time because the banks are not lending to small businesses. They themselves are probably now struggling. I mean, yesterday, for example, on the BBC was a fascinating woman who phoned up and pointed out how she, on this little B&B that she's running, employs 7 people, local business, and yet the problems she is facing because there is no finance available. And yet this big chain is effectively, in one sense you could argue, putting her out of business.
So 3 sets of victims, the taxpayer, the banks, and then potential competitors. But surely the upside of this is that everyone does get to keep their jobs, the company does get to keep on trading.
Yes, it should, but it might be that in the 21st century, following on from the 2008 crisis, the mess that we've got ourselves into, following on the financial issues that really derided from this sort of very aggressive view of corporate Britain from the 1980s onward. Right? It's interesting that we're filming this on the day Aslan Nadir, right, finally gets his comeuppance, his 10 years. That sort of corporate greed, excess and whatever, in his case, well done to the SFO for proceeding with it, and finally well done to the judges and the jury for sending him down. Right? And it might be a chance to rebalance that. Should we have views about, for example, that companies that deliberately gear themselves so highly, right? Debt is essential for business, but actually, is that irresponsible debt versus responsible debt?
Professor Palmer, thank you.